All right, so we have our add1 function. That's working pretty well for us. Now we want to go ahead and make our next function. Now, whenever we do any coding, you always want to think about how can I do this as efficiently as possible. So to do this efficiently, I want to just copy this function and make a new copy of it, right? I don't want to have to retype all this. Admittedly, this is not a lot to type, but when you're working with bigger programs, you do want to recycle and reuse code, especially when you know it's working already. So notice here, I just copied and then pasted the code right below. Now we have to fix a couple issues right away because we've copy and pasted code. For one, we can't have two functions both named add1. All right, let's see what happens if we try to do this. If we come over here and do add1, now we get an error message. So the error message popped up. It says compile error, ambiguous name detected, add1. So it's not compiling for us because we have two functions with the same name. In this case, the error message was pretty clear how we need to fix this. So let's say, okay. Now we come in here, let's say add1, then multiply. That's going to be our new function that we do. All right, so let's go over to our spreadsheet again. Now we can clear out our name error. We called this add1, then multiply. Notice I had wrote and1 and multiply before here, so I just picked a different name to call it in the video. But Excel tells me there's something actually called add1, then multiply. So let's take that, enter in 1, and let's see what we get. All right, we got another compile error. What did we get here? Argument not optional. All right, so what's happening here is that we forgot that first rule that we talked about in our function. And that is that the output, add1, has to be equal to the function name. Now we have add1, then multiply. That needs to be this value right here. We need to make sure that these two are consistent. So let's copy that over. Now the other thing that we want to notice now is we have a big yellow line right here. Right? This big yellow line is not going to let us do anything. We can come over here and we can't click into Excel anymore. So you're over in your spreadsheet, you don't know how to get things working again. So let me show you what we do. We have to go back into VBA and we have to reset the project. Essentially, it went into debugging mode because there was an error that it didn't know how to handle, right? We didn't have the right naming done. So what we can do is up here in the top left is this blue square. And if you highlight it, hover over it, it says reset. This resets the project, gets rid of that error message. Now once we've done that, we can go back in, we can click on our function, and we see now that the value is 2. So it's working. The code is not exactly doing what we want it to do. There's no multiplying yet, but it is at least working at this point in time. All right, so what we want to do to adapt this function is we're actually going to add a second input. So within our function, we want a second input that's now going to tell us how much to multiply that initial sum by. So what we need to do is come into our function definition, right? We have add1, then multiply, followed by our inputs. So now we simply need to add a second input. We'll call it the multiply number. And we're going to also make this as a double. So again, it's allowing for a decimal number to come in here. And this is what we're going to take that original answer and multiply it by. So now we have two inputs. What that means then is that our function's not going to work when we go back to it. And the reason is, right now we only have one input in there. So if I hit enter, we get that value error. So let's fix that. Let's put a comma 1 in. Now the function works again. Again, we have to make sure that what's happening in the Excel spreadsheet matches with what it expects in the VBA code. So again, we have our two numbers in here. Now the last step, what we need to do is actually incorporate that multiply number into our calculation. So we're going to put some parentheses around our input number plus 1, multiply it by multiply number, and then hit enter. All right, so if you've noticed what I just did there, I spelled multiply number wrong. Let's see what happens because of that misspelling. We come back over, we hit enter. We get a compile error. It says the variable is not defined. All right, this is part of the reason why we use option explicit. Option explicit forces us to define our variables. There is no variable called multiply number without the E in it. Instead, we have the multiply number. And so once we correct this, put our E in there, again, reset our project, we should have it work again. Let's go back in, We're now getting an answer out. Now let's see if it's working. Instead of 1, let's start with 2. So we'll get 2 plus 1 is 3. Let's multiply that by 3. We should get 9. 9's coming out. Let's try another one. Let's do 3 plus 1. That's going to be 4 times 2 should give us 8. It looks like our function's working. Sometimes you want to play around with it a little bit more, make sure you can't get any other errors out of it. But for right now, we've built our first and second functions here. Both took in inputs and gave our output back to the user. As a final step, one thing that's always good to do is go back and comment your code. You can always do this while you're going, or you can kind of come back and do it later. Here I'm going to say function adds 1 to first input and then multiplies sum by second input. Something that describes what the function does. We can go to the first function, adds 1 to input. And now we have a couple comments on here that tell exactly what the function is doing. Admittedly, this is not that important when we have these very simple short functions, but as you get into bigger code, commenting is going to be very important. And we'll talk more about that in the future videos.